There comes a point in every story where the past doesn't just politely ask to be revisited. It straight up demands to be understood. And in the years after Nicole Kidman's public admission, Keith Urban finally started seeing his biggest regret differently. Not as a wound, not as some heavy weight dragging him down, but as the exact moment that forced him to become the man he now recognizes in the mirror. What surprised him most wasn't the world's reaction to their story. It was his own. He thought shame would hit him. He thought the old guilt would slide back in like a familiar shadow. But instead, something else rose up inside him. Clarity. Real, undeniable clarity. For years, Keith believed his regret was one night. One breaking point. But the truth? It was way more complicated than that. The regret wasn't a single moment. It was the person he used to be. The man who ran from pain. Who hid behind music. Who thought love only counted when it was calm and easy, not when the storms hit hard. He often wondered what would have happened if Nicole had walked away. He imagined the silence filling the house. The meals eaten alone. The songs he would have written from devastation instead of rebirth. He imagined himself slipping back into the haze he had fought like hell to escape. But that's not the life he lived. Because Nicole stayed. And her choice became the foundation for everything that followed. One afternoon, Keith sat in a quiet Nashville cafe, tucked away in the corner behind sunglasses and a worn baseball cap. He watched couples pass by, laughing, arguing, pushing strollers, sharing coffee, and he wondered how many of them carried secrets the world would never know. How many had almost lost everything? How many chose to stay? How many wished they had? He scribbled in his journal, something he'd done since before fame, filling pages with reflections he never planned to publish. Regret is not a cage, he wrote. It's a compass. It points you to who you refuse to be again. Later that night, he read those words to Nicole as they sat on the back porch. She listened quietly, legs folded beneath her, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. When he finished, she looked at him for a long time before saying, "That's the man I was waiting for." It was the closest thing to closure he had ever felt. But life has a way of testing even the strongest closure. During a major awards show that year, Keith was scheduled to perform. Nicole, glowing in a cream gown, walked beside him down the red carpet. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Questions flew like sparks. How did your marriage survive the hardest years? Do you regret staying with Keith? Is there anything you still want to apologize for? Nicole squeezed his hand. The noise faded into a dull hum. Keith leaned in and whispered, "You don't have to answer anything." But she did. Because the silence she had carried for years wasn't armor anymore. It was history. And history didn't need to stay hidden. She turned to the microphone and said calmly, "We survived because we never stopped choosing each other. Even when it hurt. Even when it scared us. Even when it seemed easier to walk away." The crowd went dead silent. Keith felt something inside him break and rebuild at the same time. Pride. Gratitude. All. Nicole continued, "Regret doesn't ruin a marriage. Silence does. We stopped being silent." Within hours, her words were everywhere. Millions watched the clip, replayed it, wrote about it. Experts analyzed it. Fans praised her honesty and strength. Many called it the most powerful moment of the night, more powerful than any performance. But the moment that mattered most happened later at home. Their oldest daughter, now old enough to understand parts of their past, approached Nicole carefully. "Mom," she asked, "were you scared back then?" Nicole knelt down and gently took her hands. "Yes," she said honestly, "but I was brave, too. And your father was brave. That's how families survive." Keith stood in the doorway, chest tight, eyes warm. It was the first time he saw their healing reflected in their children. Proof that the pain they endured had turned into wisdom instead of wounds. The next morning, they walked around their property. The sun was soft. The air carried the scent of dew. They didn't talk for a while, just walked side by side through the grass. Finally, Keith asked, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Nicole took a breath, thinking carefully. "No, because without it, you wouldn't be who you are. And we wouldn't be who we are." It wasn't praising the pain. It was acknowledging the transformation. For the first time, his regret didn't feel like a scar. It felt like a beginning. Later that year, Keith performed a private charity show. Instead of opening with something upbeat, he sat on a stool, guitar resting across his leg, and told a story he had never shared publicly. "There was a moment in my life," he said softly, "when I almost lost the person who saved me. I carry that moment with me, not to punish myself, but to remind myself how far I've come. And if you need to hear this, you're not defined by your worst night. You're defined by the mornings you choose to rise. The room held its breath. When he finished, Nicole walked onto the stage, surprising everyone. She took his hand, rested her head against his shoulder, not as an actress, not as a celebrity, but as a woman who fought for her marriage and won. The audience stood. Keith felt tears gather. Nicole wiped one away and whispered, "It's over. And we're here." Their story, once buried in secrecy and regret, had become something else entirely. A testament to resilience. A celebration of growth. A love rebuilt stronger than before. Because real love isn't measured by the absence of regret. It's measured by the courage to rebuild after the storm. As Keith moved deeper into this new era of honesty, he realized regret had never been the enemy. Silence was. The silence he used to drown himself in. The silence Nicole once carried like armor. The silence that nearly broke them. Now, the silence between them held something different. Trust. But the world had changed. Nicole's interview had opened a door they couldn't fully close. Suddenly, everyone wanted more. Details. Timelines. Drama. They wanted the wound, not the healing. One morning at the kitchen table, Keith drinking coffee, Nicole reading a script, a headline flashed on her phone. What really happened the night Keith Urban almost lost Nicole Kidman? Nicole sighed, not embarrassed, just tired. "I'm sorry," Keith said instinctively. "For what?" she asked. "For all of this. That it's coming back again." She reached across and touched his hand. "Keith, the past doesn't scare me anymore. And it shouldn't scare you either." Her calm steadied him, but he still felt responsible. Not just for the headlines, but for their private journey becoming public property. So later that week, in the studio, he made a decision. He wouldn't run from the story. He'd own it. He turned emotion into music. The song he wrote, titled What Love Survives, was raw, honest, unapologetic. He sang about failure, forgiveness, redemption, Nicole's courage, his rebirth. He sang about love enduring even when the world demands answers. When he played it for Nicole, she listened with her eyes closed. Not smiling, not crying, just absorbing. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes. "That," she whispered, "is what I stayed for." Music became the bridge between their past and future. It didn't erase regret. It transformed it. Then came another challenge. Nicole was invited to do a long-form interview with a respected journalist known for deep conversations. They promised respect, nuance, no sensationalism. "Do you want to do it?" Keith asked. "I think I do," she said quietly. "Not for them. For us. To close the chapter fully." He nodded, even though part of him feared reopening everything. The night before the interview, they stood on their balcony. Moonlight spilled softly across the lawn. "I don't want you to feel like you owe the world anything," Keith said. "I don't owe the world," Nicole replied. "But I owe myself freedom from silence. And from the fear of being misunderstood." She had always been strong. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady. When the interview aired, it stunned people. Not because of scandal, but because of grace. "Regret doesn't define a person," she said. "How they rise afterward does. I didn't stay because I'm a saint. I stayed because love is a choice. And I still choose him." The internet exploded. Keith watched alone. When she walked in afterward, he stood up, throat tight. "Thank you," he whispered. "I wasn't protecting the past," she said, wrapping her arms around him. "I was protecting the future." And just like that, the last pieces of guilt he'd been carrying finally started to let go. Their youngest daughter hugged him later that night. "I'm glad you're my dad," she said. In that moment, he understood something deep. His biggest regret had become a lesson. Not shame, but proof that people can change. Weeks later, they took a quiet vacation. Just the two of them. No cameras. No noise. On the final night, sitting on a quiet beach, waves folding into each other, Nicole whispered, "You know what the real miracle is? We didn't break." Keith squeezed her hand. "We bent," he said, "and we healed." Their story, once filled with silence, regret, addiction, and near loss, had become the story of two people who refused to quit. Not because it was easy, but because it was theirs. And now when people look at Keith and Nicole and see strength and unity, they're seeing something forged in fire. Something rebuilt from ashes. Something earned. Because real love isn't proven by perfection. It's proven by resurrection. In every great love story, there's a final truth. A truth that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't beg for applause. It just settles into your heart like a long-awaited sunrise. And for Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman, that truth showed up quietly, way after the headlines cooled off. Long after the interviews stopped, long after the world moved on to fresh scandals and new obsessions, it arrived on a regular, low-key morning. Keith woke up before dawn, the house dead silent, the sky still pitch dark. He padded into the kitchen barefoot, hair tousled, eyes heavy with sleep. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, he glanced toward the window and saw Nicole outside, wrapped in a blanket, sitting on the porch swing with her knees pulled in close. He stepped out. The air was cool, the first hint of sunrise brushing the horizon. "You're up early," he said softly. She smiled without turning. "Couldn't sleep. Just thinking." He sat beside her, the swing creaking gently under their weight. After a moment, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "What about?" he asked. Nicole pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "Everything we went through. Everything we survived. In a strange way, I don't regret any of it now." Keith felt his breath catch. For years he'd carried the fear that she might look back with resentment, with exhaustion, with the quiet sadness of someone who stayed because she had to, not because she wanted to. "You don't?" he asked softly. Nicole finally looked up at him, her eyes glowing in the first light of dawn. "No," she whispered, "because it led us here." And in that moment, simple, still, almost fragile, Keith understood the truth he'd been chasing through interviews, through music, through years of unspoken guilt. His biggest regret had turned into the doorway to his greatest transformation. Not because mistakes should be glorified, not because pain should be romanticized, but because love, real love, isn't measured by the absence of heartbreak. It's measured by what you build after the heartbreak. Later that day, Keith drove to the recording studio with a quiet determination. He'd been working on a new song, but something in him felt unfinished. Something needed to be said clearly, fully, no half measures. He finally sat in the booth, closed his eyes, and began to sing. No instruments, no production, just his voice. A confession, a promise, a closure. His producer listened from the control room, stunned by the rawness of it. When Keith finished, the room went silent. "What do you want to call it?" the producer asked quietly. Keith wiped a tear from his cheek and replied, "The man she saw." Uncrushed. Because that was the truth at the center of everything. Nicole had seen the man he could become long before he did. When he got home that evening, he found Nicole in the garden, barefoot, clipping roses. He walked toward her, heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. "I finished the song," he said. She turned with a gentle smile. "Is it about us?" Keith nodded. "All of it." Nicole placed the roses in a basket and walked toward him, her steps soft in the late-day sunlight. "Then play it for me," she whispered. They sat on the back porch, sunlight melting into twilight. He held the guitar gently across his lap and played the first chord. Nicole closed her eyes, letting the music carry her through the memories, some painful, some beautiful, all essential. The lyrics weren't about regret. They were about redemption. Not about fear, but about grace. Not about the night he almost lost her, but about the thousands of mornings since. Every small victory, every gentle touch, every quiet forgiveness, every choice they made to stay. When the final note faded, Nicole opened her eyes and looked at him with a tenderness Keith had rarely seen. Not the tenderness of a wife, the tenderness of a witness. Someone who saw the whole journey, not just the storm. "It's beautiful," she said. "Because it's true." Keith exhaled shakily, emotion thick in his voice. "I want the world to hear it, but only if you're ready." Nicole stepped closer, cupped his face in her hands, and said, "It's not a story about your mistake. It's a story about our survival. Let them hear it." And just like that, the final chapter wrote itself. The song was released a month later. And unlike the viral interviews, unlike the speculative headlines, unlike all the Hollywood gossip noise, this moment felt different. It felt sacred. Fans listened not with curiosity, but with reverence. Couples wrote saying the song helped them heal. Listeners struggling with addiction said it gave them hope. People who had nearly lost everything said it made them believe in second chances again. Keith and Nicole watched quietly from the sidelines. Not chasing the spotlight. Not hunting applause. Just holding hands as the world finally heard the truth they'd lived through. One night, after reading hundreds of messages from fans, Nicole set her phone down and whispered, "Your regret helped people." Keith looked at her with quiet awe. "No," he said softly. "Your strength did." Nicole smiled. Slow. Knowing. It was both of us. Together. And that was the truth. History would remember not the mistake, not the scandal, not the silence, but the resurrection. A marriage rebuilt. A family strengthened. Two people who walked through fire and came out carrying light. As the final scene of their story fades into the quiet hum of everyday life, one thing becomes clear. Keith Urban's biggest regret didn't define him. It refined him. And Nicole Kidman breaking her silence didn't expose their past. It freed their future. Because real love doesn't promise a life without storms. It promises the courage to rebuild after the storm passes. And that, quietly, powerfully, undeniably, is exactly what they did. There are stories in Hollywood that start with applause, glamour, and the sweet taste of victory. And then there are stories like this one, born from silence, carved by scars, carried through years of unspoken truth. When Keith Urban finally stepped into the light and admitted the deepest regret of his life, the world felt something shift. But no one expected Nicole Kidman, the woman who had stood beside him, forgiven him, weathered the storms, to break her silence too. It started quietly, like a tremor under the surface. Keith Urban, at 57, spoke in a way he never had before. His voice was steady, but there was fragility behind each word, like he was peeling back a layer he'd hidden for way too long. "There was a moment," he said, "when I almost lost everything that mattered to me. And there's not a day I don't regret it." He didn't say Nicole's name. He didn't have to. The regret hung in the air like smoke. Thick, undeniable. To understand what he meant, you have to go back years. Back to a time when fame felt like a fortress he could hide inside. Keith had always been the guy who turned pain into melodies, who stood under blinding stage lights while fighting shadows nobody else could see. The world adored him. Crowds screamed his name. But behind the curtain, a storm was building. Nicole Kidman entered his life like a calm breath after a hurricane. She had her own history, her own wounds, her own secrets carved deep into her heart. But she was steady, gentle, and she believed in him in a way nobody else ever had. They looked perfect together. The Hollywood star and the country music icon. Red carpets painted them gold. Headlines crowned them a miracle story. But miracles don't come cheap. Keith's battle with addiction wasn't just a chapter. It was a war. And in the early years of their marriage, that war almost wrecked everything. He tried to outrun his past. But the past doesn't play fair. Nights blurred. Promises broke. Nicole, who had already stood in the ruins of a previous marriage, found herself staring at a heartbreak she never signed up to relive. There was one night. Keith has never shared the details. But those close to him say it was the breaking point. The night he calls the regret. The moment he pushed too far. Crossed the line. When Nicole looked at him with a kind of pain that burned deeper than anger, and it hit him hard. She had every reason to walk away. Every right to slam the door and say, "I'm done." She had survived enough storms, public heartbreaks, private losses. No one would have judged her for choosing peace over chaos. But she stayed. On one condition. Keith had to choose. Between the life that numbed him and the life that needed him. Between addiction and love. Between self-destruction and rebuilding. He entered rehab. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't peaceful. It was a battlefield. Between the voice telling him he wasn't enough and the woman who kept whispering that he was. When he came out months later, Keith Urban wasn't brand new. He was rebuilt. And the regret, the moment he almost lost Nicole Kidman forever, became a silent weight he carried like an invisible scar. For years, fans sensed there was more to their story. More than interviews showed. More than public smiles revealed. They saw the tenderness at award shows. The quiet glances. The way Keith held her hand just a little tighter. But they never knew the truth underneath. Until now. Nicole Kidman, after years of choosing silence over spectacle, finally spoke. It happened during a rare interview. A question about forgiveness. A question about resilience. And then her guard dropped. "There was a moment when I thought I might lose him," she said softly. "But love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing someone even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She didn't criticize him. Didn't spill details. She just told the truth. She had been the anchor when he was drifting. The light when everything around him dimmed. And for the first time, she acknowledged the pain she had carried alone. He regrets that moment, she added. And so do I. But we rebuilt from it. Together. There was no bitterness in her voice. No victory lap. Just honesty. Raw and real. The world reacted instantly. Headlines exploded. Fans flooded social media. Old interviews resurfaced. That one sentence, "There was a moment when I thought I might lose him," sparked a global conversation. What really happened? How close did they come to losing it all? Why did it take so long for the truth to come out? Keith stayed silent after her interview. Not out of shame. Out of respect. Because the regret wasn't just his. It belonged to both of them. And somehow, that shared regret became the turning point that transformed their marriage. From that moment on, Keith Urban stopped running. Stopped hiding. He built his recovery not on promises, but on action. He became the man Nicole had always believed he could be. A man who could love without fear. Perform without pain. Stand without falling. Today, their marriage looks unbreakable. But it didn't get that way through perfection. It got there through fire, through rebuilding, through choosing each other again and again, no matter how hard it got. It became that way through scars, through nights spent rebuilding trust, through mornings that felt fragile, through the decision repeated over and over again to choose love again. And that's exactly why Keith Urban finally said it. Because when regret is spoken out loud, it stops being a secret and starts becoming a lesson. And Nicole Kidman breaking her silence? That became the truth behind the myth. Sometimes the biggest heartbreak isn't the moment someone walks away. It's the moment you realize how close they came to leaving and how unbelievably lucky you are that they stayed. For years, the world only saw the polished edges of Keith Urban's rise. Stadiums packed with roaring fans, glittering awards, that confident smile that looked like it was carved for the spotlight. But fame? Fame hides fractures. And Keith's life had plenty of them. Thin cracks that slowly spread until one day they nearly snapped everything in half. What made his biggest regret so devastating wasn't just the mistake itself. It was the moment he understood how deeply it wounded the one person he never, ever wanted to hurt. After rehab, Keith tried to step back into normal life. But normal didn't fit anymore. He wasn't the same man. The world didn't feel the same. Nicole wasn't the same either. Not resentful. Not cold. Just different, like someone carrying a bruise they don't want you to see. She moved gently. She spoke softly. She forgave he. But forgiveness, at its core, is fragile. It doesn't erase the past. It just lets you walk through it without drowning in it. Keith felt that fragility every single day. One night, after a long tour rehearsal, he came home and found Nicole sitting alone in the living room. The house was quiet, just the low hum of the lights. She looked up when he walked in, tender, but tired. He sat beside her and, without saying a word, took her hand. She didn't pull away. For a second, it felt like finally breathing after being underwater way too long. Then she said something that stayed with Chaim forever. "I just need you to be present," she whispered. "Not perfect, just present." That's when Keith really got it. The real cost of his regret wasn't the headlines. It wasn't the public judgment. It was the quiet way pain lingers in the corners of a relationship. The way it changes the air. The way it makes even love feel cautious. That hit different. That night, he made a vow to show up. To be there. To stop disappearing into the shadows of his own mind. But change isn't some overnight glow-up. It's messy. Slow. Full of screw-ups and second guesses. There were days the pressure of the industry sat on Chaim like a mountain. Days he wondered if he could ever truly become the man Nicole believed he could be. Days when regret crashed back in like waves that just wouldn't quit. In one of his darkest stretches, Keith turned to music, not as a career, but as survival. He wrote in silence, letting every lyric bleed out of him. He filled notebooks with confessions he could never say out loud. Songs became therapy. A confession booth. The only place where truth felt safe. One afternoon, Nicole quietly slipped into the studio while he was recording a stripped-down, raw piece he never planned to share. She sat there, silent, listening to every note, every breath, every crack in his voice. When the song ended, Keith looked up, embarrassed, exposed, like she'd just walked in on a secret he didn't know how to explain. "That's the man I stayed for," she said softly. It wasn't hype. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. Of the effort. The growth. The fight. Their healing didn't happen in big dramatic movie scenes. It happened in small, ordinary moments. Cooking dinner together, Quiet morning coffee before the kids woke up, long drives with music low and hands intertwined. And in those rare moments when Nicole finally let the hurt she'd buried rise to the surface. One of the most significant chapters of their recovery came when Nicole started working on a film that forced her to dig into deep emotional pain. She told Keith some scenes reopened wounds, not from the script, but from memories of Haim before he changed. Instead of shrinking into guilt, Keith stayed. He listened. He held her. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to spin his past. He just showed up, like he promised. That's when Nicole realized something powerful. Keith wasn't carrying regret like a burden anymore. He was carrying it like responsibility. He wasn't chained to his past. He was honoring it by becoming a different man. Still, their story wasn't some straight, perfect line. Hollywood rarely gives anyone privacy. Every tea they walked a red carpet, every award show, every interview. Reporters poked at old scars. Nicole deflected with grace, but Keith could see it. That flicker in her eyes. That shadow of what they'd survived. For years, she stayed silent. Not out of fear, out of dignity. She didn't want their pain turned into clickbait. She didn't want strangers dissecting their healing. She wanted their story to stay theirs. But silence, too, can get heavy. The day Nicole finally spoke publicly about their darkest chapter was the day she realized silence wasn't protecting them anymore. It was suffocating the truth they'd fought so hard to build. Her words were simple, honest, raw. "We survived something very difficult," she said. "And he regrets it. I regret it. But love sometimes is the act of rebuilding what you almost lost." That statement echoed louder than any scandal. And for once, Hollywood didn't respond with cynicism. It responded with awe. Because this wasn't PR. It wasn't damage control. It was human. Real. Keith watched the interview backstage during rehearsal for a tribute event. And for the first time in years, tears rose. Not from regret, but from gratitude. Nicole had carried Haim through a storm. And now she stood beside Haim again. This team. In front of the world. Later that night, he texted her one sentence. "Thank you for still choosing us." She replied, "I always will." No dramatic soundtrack. No cinematic speech. Just real. And that's what made it powerful. Today, the regret still exists. But not as an open wound. As a reminder. A compass. A quiet promise between two people who learned something the hard way. Love doesn't break in the storm. It breaks in the silence after. And if you survive that silence, you can survive anything. Healing is never a straight road. It bends. Detours. Loops back to places you thought you left behind. For Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman, the years after his confession were filled with quiet wins and unexpected triggers. Moments that forced them to face the past all over again. Keith learned fast. Regret isn't something you conquer once. It circles back. Sometimes gently. Sometimes like a test you didn't study for. And every tea it resurfaced, Nicole felt it too. One evening at a small private dinner, a friend casually joked about celebrity marriages. How nobody really lasts in Hollywood. Keith laughed it off. Nicole smiled. But that night, back home, he found her by the window, staring into the dark with a stillness that unsettled him. "What's wrong?" he asked. "We almost became that cliché," she said quietly. It wasn't blame. It wasn't anger. It was the echo of a fear she'd carried deep, that one day she might lose Haim to the very world that almost swallowed Haim whole. Keith sat beside her and took her hand, just like he had years earlier. This team, the silence between them wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was full of history, of survival, of understanding. "We didn't," he whispered. "Because of you." Nicole didn't answer right away. She rarely spoke emotionally unless it mattered. Then she leaned her head on his shoulder. And for a moment, the world disappeared. That night reminded Keith of something real. Regret doesn't disappear. It reshapes you, makes you see clearer, listen better, love deeper. He needed that reminder. Because months later, another test came. Not from the past, from the future. Nicole was offered a major film role, emotionally demanding, vulnerable, heavy. She hesitated, not because she doubted herself, but because she knew it would reopen old spaces inside her. Keith told her to take it. "You've carried me," he said. "Let me carry you now." During filming, Nicole dove into the character so deeply that sometimes she came home emotionally distant. Not angry, not slipping away, just carrying the role inside her. One night after an especially intense scene, She came home quiet and tearful. Keith wrapped his arms around her and didn't ask questions. He knew some pain doesn't need explaining. It just needs somewhere to land. And for the first he since their darkest days, Nicole let herself cry fully in front of Haim. Not from heartbreak, from exhaustion, from vulnerability. "You're here," she whispered between breaths. "I'm here," he replied. Simple, but everything. It meant they had come full circle. Of course, Hollywood never leaves anything untouched. Weeks later, at a press conference, a reporter asked, "Nicole, did your role remind you of the challenges you faced in your marriage?" The room went still. Nicole didn't flinch. Silence had taught her composure. Strength. She looked at the reporter and answered calmly. "Every marriage has challenges. Ours did, too. But we faced them. We learned and we grew. That's what matters. No bitterness. No shame. Just truth." The interview went viral. Headlines everywhere. Social media buzzing with theories. But what people noticed most? The tone of her voice. Steady. Reflective. Deeply human. She wasn't exposing Keith. She wasn't out here selling drama or chasing headlines. She was honoring the journey they survived, plain and simple. Keith saw the clip between rehearsals and felt something shift inside him. A mix of pride and raw emotion tightened his chest. Nicole had finally spoken, not to rip open old wounds, but to close them for good. He sent her a message. "I'm proud of you and grateful every day." She replied minutes later. "Then we're even. I'm grateful too." Their story should have found peace right there. But regret, even when it's healed, has a funny way of circling back in unexpected forms. Months later, Keith dropped a new album, deeply personal, packed with lyrics about redemption, fear, and salvation. Fans called it the most vulnerable music he had ever written. Critics praised its honesty. But one song hit different. A quiet, haunting track titled "The Night I Almost Lost You." Listeners speculated nonstop. Some said it was about addiction. Others thought it hinted at a near divorce. But Nicole knew exactly what it was about. The night she almost walked out of their marriage for good. She listened to the song alone first, in complete silence, and it wrecked her. Not because it reopened wounds, but because it revealed how deeply Keith had carried that night with him. How regret had shaped every step he took after. How love had forced him to rebuild himself piece by piece. That evening, Nicole walked into the room where Keith was reviewing final mixes. She didn't say a word. She just placed her hand on his heart and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." Keith didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat tightened. His eyes burned. And for the first time since he wrote the song, he let himself actually feel everything he had poured into it. Their story wasn't about regret anymore. It was about resurrection. Today, when fans see Keith and Nicole on red carpets, they see elegance, chemistry, unity. But what they don't see, what only the two of them truly know, is the battlefield beneath those smiles. The nights spent rebuilding trust. The mornings filled with quiet gratitude. The forgiveness that didn't come once, but again and again. Because in the end, Keith Urban's biggest regret didn't destroy them. It saved them. It showed them what they almost lost, and what they were brave enough to fight for. There are turning points in life that don't come with fireworks or loud applause. Sometimes they slide in quietly, almost unnoticed, soft shifts that redirect the future. For Keith Urban, one of those moments came on a rainy evening in Nashville. Years after the storm that nearly ended his marriage, he had just finished a show, the kind that left him sweating, breathless, and humbled by thousands of fans who still believed in him. As he walked backstage, guitar still humming from the final note, he found Nicole waiting in the dim light. She wore a simple coat, her hair damp from the rain, her smile soft but tired. "You were incredible," she said. He kissed her forehead, and in that embrace, he felt her warmth settle the chaos inside him. They drove home in silence. The kind of silence that speaks instead of stings. Somewhere along that familiar road, Keith said something unexpected. "I still think about that night," he whispered. Nicole didn't ask which night. She knew. There was only one night in their history that carried that much weight. The night he almost lost her. She reached over and gently touched his hand on the gear shift. "It's part of us," she said softly. "But it doesn't own us anymore." Those words sank deep into Keith's heart. For years, he had feared the opposite, that regret defined him, that it overshadowed everything good he had built since. Hearing Nicole say it out loud felt like a release. Like chains finally loosening after being worn way too long. What Keith didn't know was that Nicole had been carrying a confession of her own. It came weeks later during a quiet afternoon at home. Their kids were out with friends. The house was wrapped in rare, peaceful stillness. Nicole sat at the piano, an instrument she rarely touched, and played a few soft notes. Keith heard the faint melody from down the hall and wandered in. "That's beautiful," he said. She smiled without looking up. "It's nothing. Just something I used to play when I was overwhelmed." He sat beside her, waiting. Nicole paused, fingers hovering over the keys, then turned toward him with a vulnerability he rarely saw. "I wasn't sure I could stay," she whispered. Back then, Keith's breath caught. He had always known, deep down. But hearing her say it out loud hit him with a truth he wasn't ready for. "I know," he said quietly. "No," she corrected gently. "You don't. I didn't stay because I wasn't hurt. I stayed because I still believed in who you could become." That landed harder than any criticism ever had. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't justification. It was love, the kind that holds on through pain. Painful optimism. A belief that survives even when the evidence looks thin. Nicole continued, her voice steady but fragile. "I kept thinking, if I leave, he'll fall. And if he falls, he won't get back up." Keith swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." She shook her head softly. "I'm not telling you this for apologies. I'm telling you so you understand why your regret can't keep defining you. You've changed. You've grown. You rebuilt yourself. Don't let that night cast a shadow over everything else." It was the closest Nicole had ever come to describing her own internal battle. And for Keith, it felt like finally hearing the missing piece of a story he'd been trying to understand for years. Her confession wasn't just emotional. It was freeing. For the first time, he realized her silence all those years wasn't secrecy. It was protection. She had been protecting him, their children, their marriage, even her own heart. She spoke softly because she didn't want their pain turned into a spectacle. She stayed quiet because the truth was theirs, not the world's. But eventually, the world pushed in. When Nicole broke her silence publicly, she didn't do it to expose him. She did it to free them both from the story others had written. The story that they were perfect, that nothing had shaken them, that their marriage was built on effortless harmony. Her interview triggered waves of reaction, sympathy, admiration, shock, speculation. Some praised her honesty. Others dissected every word. But Nicole didn't care. She had spoken her truth. That alone gave her peace. After the interview, Keith found her sitting on the porch of their Tennessee home, legs tucked under her, watching the sunset. "You were brave," he said, sitting beside her. "No," she replied. "I was honest." "That's different." He smiled. "Honesty takes bravery." Nicole turned to him with a faint grin. "So does regret." And in that moment, Keith understood why her words resonated with so many people. They weren't about dragging up the past. They were about owning it. Love isn't the absence of mistakes. It's the decision to survive them. But the real shift in their marriage didn't come from the interview. It came from what followed. Letters poured in from around the world. Not gossip, not drama, gratitude. Couples shared their struggles. Recovering addicts wrote about relapse and redemption. Women spoke about the difficulty of staying and the difficulty of leaving. Men opened up about pride, regret, vulnerability. Keith and Nicole read the letters together late at night. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes with tears. "This is why we told the truth," Nicole said one evening. "So people stop feeling alone." In a way neither of them expected, their private pain became healing for others. One letter changed everything. It came from a woman in her 60s who wrote, "Love is not about forgetting the worst night. It's about creating enough good days afterward that the worst night no longer defines you." Nicole read it out loud. Keith closed his eyes and let the words sink in. That was it. That was their story. Not the scandal. Not the near ending. Not just the regret. The rebuilding. The resurrection. The quiet courage of two people choosing each other when walking away might have been easier. Today, Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman don't stand as a perfect couple. They stand as a real one. Scarred. Humbled. Changed. Their love isn't fragile. It's weathered. Tested. Proven. And in the end, the biggest regret Keith Urban ever carried became the very thing that taught him how to love fiercely, fully, and without fear.